The year was 1879. The New Mexico borderlands stretched wide and mean a land of red dust and bone-dry wind where only the toughest souls dared to linger. The sun was sinking fast, spilling gold over the sagebrush and cottonwoods before the cold came sliding down from the hills. Eli McCord rode his bay horse along the creek trail, the reins slack in his weathered hand. A dented pail swung from his saddle horn, half filled with muddy water. His back stayed straight as a fence post, his face cut with the kind of lines that only grief and years of silence can carve. Eli was 39, tall, broad across the shoulders, skin baked dark by the desert sun. He still wore his Union Army coat, faded to a ghostly gray, though the war had ended more than 10 years back. He had buried his wife, Clara McCord, not long after the fighting stopped. Fever took her before she saw 30. Since that day, his life had shrunk down to a single-purpose survival: fixing fences with rotten boards, driving lean cattle across dry pastures, cutting wood, stacking it neat, and watching it burn slow through lonely nights. He had no plans, no hopes left to lose. The horse followed a narrow side trail down toward the creek's bend. Eli only meant to fill the bucket before dark, but when the water came into view, he reined hard and froze. There, waist-deep in the creek, stood 3 Apache women. Their long black hair clung to their shoulders, glistening in the dying light. Bronze skin shimmered beneath the ripples. On the sandy bank lay their torn dresses, deerskin and beadwork, the colors long faded from travel and hardship. The sight hit him like a rifle crack. Strangers. Out here. His first instinct was to turn the horse and get the hell gone. Trouble always came with strangers, especially Apache. Folks in town still called them enemies, said they brought death where they went. Being seen near them could burn a man's name to ash faster than prairie fire. But the women didn't scream or hide. They stared back at him, calm, unflinching, as if they had already made a choice. The tallest stepped forward, water breaking against her hips. Her braid was bound with a strip of leather and a feather at the end. Her voice came low but sure, her English rough yet certain. "You saw us bathing in the lake," she said. "Now you have to marry us." Eli's fingers tightened on the reins. For a moment he thought it was a trick, maybe bait for an ambush. But there was no mockery in her eyes, only the weight of something old, something that felt like law. Behind her stood the second Nita, her hair loose and heavy down her back dress, torn at the shoulders. Her gaze held caution, but no hate. Closer to the bank lingered the youngest Tallulah, shorter, rounder, her tattered dress showing skin where seams had split. Despite her hunger and exhaustion, a spark still burned in her dark eyes, bold and alive. Eli swallowed hard. Every part of him screamed to turn away, to ride home, and lock the world outside. But another feeling crept in: pity, and something older than pity. He knew what it was to lose everything, to be hollowed out until only silence remained. He didn't answer, just tugged the reins and rode on the pail, sloshing against the saddle. But when he looked back, the women were already climbing from the water, tying what little remained of their dresses, their wet hair dark against their backs. Barefoot they followed, slow, steady, never speaking, never stopping, until the dying sun found all 4 of them standing before Eli's lonely cabin on the edge of the desert. The sunset bled into a soft orange glow as Eli McCord rode up to his weather-beaten cabin. The roof sagged, the porch leaned, and the barn beside it had caved halfway in, tired as the man who called it home. He slid off his horse and tied the reins to the post. Behind him, the 3 Apache women stood a few paces away, silent still as fence posts in the dusk. Eli felt that old knot of fear twist in his chest. The thought of what the town might whisper if they ever saw this, but it came with a sharper truth. Those women had nowhere else to go. Inside, the lamp burned weak and low, its flame painting the log walls in trembling gold. For years, Eli had stepped through that doorway alone. Now he stood holding it open as the women approached. Ayanna lifted her chin, meeting his eyes with quiet strength. His stomach tightened. Every part of him said to shut the door to keep his world small and safe. But his hand wouldn't move. One by one they crossed the threshold, dresses still damp, hair dripping trails of water onto the floorboards. Tallulah gave a shy, crooked smile. Nita kept her eyes down. Ayanna passed him with the calm certainty of someone used to deciding her own fate. Eli shut the door behind them. For the first time in years, the sound inside wasn't just his boots or the creak of wood. It was breathing soft and human. The air felt heavier, almost alive. He set the water pail near the stove and stood awkwardly aware of their eyes following every motion. He cleared his throat, his voice rough from disuse. "Sit." It came out low, almost a growl, but it wasn't anger, just the only tone he had left. Ayanna nodded once and led her sisters to the table. Their dresses clung to their skin as they sat. Tallulah's curious gaze swept over the room, the cracked stove door, the near-empty shelves stacked with only beans, cornmeal, and an old coffee tin. Nita glanced toward the lamp, its flame fluttering behind dusty glass, then lowered her head again. None of them spoke. Eli busied himself with the stove, feeding it kindling, pouring water into a dented pot. Their silence pressed on him like the desert heat. He told himself they'd stay one night, warm up, rest, and be gone by sunrise. But the thought of what the town would say gnawed at him. 3 Apache women under his roof. Out here, charity looked an awful lot like sin. The law was thin as paper, and gossip carried faster than gunfire. He set a pot of beans to cook, stirred in some cornmeal. It wasn't much, never had been. He'd lived off scraps for years, cooking only for one. Now his eyes drifted to the shelves, counting how long his meager stores might last if they stayed. He didn't need to finish the count to know not long. Then Ayanna spoke her English, rough but steady. "We walk long. No food. Many days." Eli's gaze rose to hers. She looked older than her years, not in her face, but in the weight she carried. He thought of the talk in town, soldiers burning camps, families scattered to the hills. These 3 weren't wanderers by choice. They were what was left behind. He asked quietly, "What about your people?" She shook her head once. "Gone." Tallulah's eyes flashed, torn between grief and defiance. Nita's filled with unshed tears before she turned away. He didn't need more words. The story was written plain on their faces. Eli felt that old emptiness stir inside him, the same hollow that had swallowed him after Clara died. The silence in his cabin, the nights too long and too still. He knew that emptiness was living inside these women now. The beans bubbled softly, filling the room with the scent of survival. Eli ladled thin portions into 4 bowls and set them down. They ate quickly, neat and quiet, not wasting a single grain. Tallulah's eyes lifted once, meeting his half-challenge, half-gratitude. When the bowls were empty, Eli pushed back his chair. "There's blankets," he muttered, pointing toward a trunk by the wall. "Floor's cold, best you take them," Eli muttered, motioning toward the trunk by the wall. Nita, quiet until now, stood and crossed the room. She lifted the lid and pulled out a stack of old wool blankets, threadbare in places but still warm enough to chase the chill. The sisters spread them out near the stove, close to the last coals of the dying fire. A soft laugh escaped Tallulah at something Ayanna said, in Apache, light, quick, almost musical. The sound startled Eli. It had been years since laughter had filled that cabin, years since anyone but him had breathed under that roof. He sat back, rubbing his rough palms together, unsure of what came next. The questions pressed heavy in his mind. What would the town say if they ever found out? Why hadn't he sent the women away? Would folks think he was keeping them here as slaves? Or worse, as wives? He hadn't asked for this. Yet when he looked at them, worn out, half-starved, with nothing but the clothes clinging to their backs, he knew he couldn't send them back into the dark. As the fire dimmed, Ayanna drew a blanket around her shoulders and met his eyes with calm understanding. "You alone, long time," she said. It wasn't a question. She already knew. Eli hesitated, caught off guard by how easily she'd seen through him. "Yeah," he answered quietly. Ayanna nodded once, then lay down beside her sisters by the stove. Their breathing soon filled the silence. Eli sat there a long while, staring into the glowing embers. Fear gnawed at him, the danger of being found out, the shortness of his supplies, but underneath that worry lived something else. Something he hadn't felt in years, the quiet weight of not being entirely alone. When he finally lay down on his own cot, he told himself again that they'd be gone by sunrise. But deep down, he knew better. Morning came slow, the pale light cutting through the cabin shutters in thin white lines. Eli woke to sounds he hadn't heard in years, the rustle of movement, the murmur of soft voices, the clink of a tin pot shifting on the stove. For a moment he thought it was a dream, that old silence still holding him prisoner. Then he saw them. Ayanna crouched by the stove, feeding and kindling. Nita folding the blankets they'd used through the night, careful with every crease, and Tallulah standing by the shelves, eyeing the tins of beans and coffee like she was taking stock. Their long black hair, still damp from the creek, clung to their backs. In daylight, their dresses looked worse, ripped seams, frayed hems, torn fabric that bared too much skin at the shoulders and knees. Eli rubbed a hand down his face, the weight of sleeplessness heavy in his bones. His first thought was simple: how much food was left, how long it would stretch, and whether he could risk a trip to Gus Harlan's trading post without drawing eyes. His second thought cut deeper the danger. If anyone in town saw Apache women on his land, it would go bad fast. Ayanna caught him staring and straightened her dark gaze, steady. "We help," she said in broken English, "not take only. Work." Eli's jaw flexed. He wanted to believe her. But all he could see was the risk, 3 women, each one a mark against his name if word got out. Yet behind that he saw something more. Survivors. People who had already lost everything a man could lose. He cleared his throat. "Your people?" he asked quietly. "Where are they now?" Ayanna's eyes dropped to the floor. "Soldiers come. Kill. Fire. Some run. Some taken. We run." Her words were short but steady. She didn't shake. Nita's hands tightened on the folded blanket. Tallulah lowered her head, her face shadowed by sorrow and defiance both. Eli felt his stomach twist. He'd seen war himself, seen towns burned and men broken, but seeing it in their eyes made it real again. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside into the morning cold. The ranch spread wide before him, broken fences, starving cattle, the barn leaning like a tired drunk. It was a picture of decay, of a man hanging on by habit, not hope. When he turned back to the cabin, smoke was already curling from the chimney. Through the open door, he saw them moving with quiet purpose, Ayanna stoking the fire, Nita tidying the room, Tallulah sweeping ashes from the hearth. They didn't ask permission. They simply acted as though they belonged. Ayanna was sweeping the floor with a broom she'd fashioned from tied willow sticks, her movements steady and sure. Nita knelt by the small stone mortar grinding cornmeal in quiet rhythm, the same mortar Eli hadn't touched in months. Tallulah carried an armful of firewood, her torn dress shifting against her curves as she bent near the stove, stacking the logs neatly. They never asked if they could do these things. They simply did. Eli felt a stir of conflict inside him, a flicker of resentment that strangers had taken over his space, and something else he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was the strange comfort of hearing life move through the cabin again after so many years of stillness. Later, as he led his horse from the post, he noticed Tallulah trailing behind him, her steps light in the dust. She watched the way he worked the reins and the gate, her dark eyes curious. She pointed to the saddle, then mimed the motion of riding. He understood. Not now, he said, voice sharper than he meant. Her smile faded and guilt pricked him, but he didn't take it back. He wasn't ready to open that door. By midday, it struck him how easily they had fit into his world. Nita patched a torn blanket with coarse thread she'd pulled from her own dress hem. Ayanna hauled water from the creek without being told. And Tallulah, bold as a songbird, hummed softly as she ground the corn, her voice warm, echoing off the log walls. The sound shouldn't have belonged there, but it did. Still, the same questions nagged at him, the kind folks in town would ask if they ever learned of this. Why didn't he send them away? Why hadn't they gone? The answer sat heavy in his chest. Because he couldn't. And because they had nowhere else to go. That evening, the four of them sat around the table. The beans were thin, stretched as far as they could go, but enough. Ayanna's arm brushed his as she reached for the bread. Nita's eyes lingered on him longer than before, though she stayed silent. Tallulah leaned back against the wall, smiling faintly as she watched him eat. For the first time in years, Eli realized he wasn't dining in silence. The cabin breathed with life, again small sounds, soft voices, the warmth of presence. Fear still sat at the edge of his thoughts, fear of the town, of what would come if word spread, but another feeling began to rise beneath it. Something quiet, unfamiliar, and human. They were turning his lonely house into something else, into a home. That night, lying in bed and staring up at the roof beams, he thought of Clara's face, the last look she'd given him before the fever took her. Then he thought of the three women asleep by his stove, wrapped in blankets, their breathing slow and steady. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in years, he didn't dread it. The next morning broke cold and brittle, the frost clinging to every blade of grass. Eli stepped outside, early boots sinking into damp soil as he crossed to the barn. The corral fence sagged in spots, one corner post nearly fallen. He'd been putting off repairs for weeks, maybe months, but now with 3 extra mouths to feed, he couldn't afford to delay. He cursed under his breath, knowing he'd have to stretch his feed and likely ride into town sooner than he wanted. When he came back inside, the women were already awake and moving with quiet purpose. Ayanna folded the blankets with care. Nita had swept the floor spotless. Tallulah stood by the stove, heating water, the fire already crackling. They worked as if the place were theirs now, and Eli knew deep down they'd decided to stay. He'd let it happen the moment he hadn't shut the door that first night. The thought of townfolk seeing them here made his stomach tighten. He could already picture the stares, the whispers at Gus Harlan's post, the trouble that would come if anyone followed him home. He poured himself coffee, sat at the table, and looked at them squarely. "If you're staying," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you'll need to work. Pull your weight for what you eat." Ayanna met his gaze and nodded. "We work," she said simply, pressing her hand flat on the table like a vow. By mid-morning, the proof was plain. Nita carried 2 heavy buckets of creek water, the handles cutting into her hands, but her steps sure. Tallulah followed Eli to the barn, watching how he cleared the old hay. When he handed her a pitchfork, half expecting her to hesitate, she gripped it tight and got to work. She wasn't strong, not yet, but she didn't quit. Eli caught himself watching her longer than he should, noticing the set of her jaw, the quiet fire in her eyes. Again, the same questions echoed, the kind only a man alone on the frontier might ask himself. Why hadn't they gone to their own people? Why hadn't he taken them to town, to the mission, to anyone else? He already knew the answer. They had no people left. And town wasn't safety. It was danger. Eli McCord, quiet as always, couldn't bring himself to drive the women back into the wilderness with nothing but rags and hunger. That afternoon he saddled his horse, tightening the worn leather straps, as his mind worked over the same thought again and again. Supplies were near gone. Beans, salt, coffee, nothing that could stretch much longer. He considered leaving them behind, but unease crept into his gut. If someone came by while he was gone, if anyone saw them, the trouble wouldn't stop at whispers. Ayanna noticed him checking the saddlebags. "Town," she asked, her voice calm but edged with caution. "Trading post," he replied. Her brow furrowed. She looked to Nita and Tallulah, then back at him. "We wait. Stay here." Eli gave a short nod and rode out the winter wind biting through his coat. The trading post sat 6 miles off a rough knot of buildings where news, whiskey, and suspicion mixed freely. He kept his head low as he tied his horse out front and stepped inside. He gathered what he needed quick, but it didn't take long for eyes to find him. A man at the counter leaned his elbow on the wood, his voice lazy but sharp. "Ain't seen you around much lately, McCord. Heard you keep into that place of yours out past the creek. Ain't much left worth seeing." Eli grunted, keeping his gaze on the coffee tin he was buying. He paid Gus Harlan and turned to go, but the man followed. "Funny thing," he said, lowering his voice. "Couple riders swore they saw sign out your way. Tracks that weren't yours. You got company out there." The question hit harder than it should have. Eli felt the heat climb his neck, but he kept his tone flat. Cattle strayed. Fence broke. Tracks everywhere this time of year. He didn't wait for a reply, just walked out, mounted up and rode. The miles home felt longer than ever, his thoughts running hot with worry. What if someone followed him? What if talk spread? When he reached the cabin, what he saw stopped him cold. The 3 women were outside working. Ayanna held a fence post steady, while Tallulah hammered nails with a rock, sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Nita gathered fallen brush into neat piles for the stove. They looked up as he rode in, but didn't stop. For a long moment, Eli sat in the saddle just watching them. They were keeping his land alive in ways he hadn't managed alone. That night, over a thin supper of beans, Ayanna spoke. "Men see you," she said simply. "Yeah," Eli replied. "Asked questions." Ayanna leaned forward, eyes steady. "If they come, we hide." Her tone carried no fear, only the certainty of someone who had survived worse. Tallulah smirked faintly, a spark of defiance in her eyes. Nita said nothing, but the soft look she gave Eli spoke clearly. "Don't send us away." Eli leaned back, hands folded, the firelight flickering across his face. He thought of Clara, how long he'd sat in that same chair, alone, eating in silence. Now 3 women sat across from him, their presence filling the space with something that felt dangerously close to life. He feared what the town might say, but the truth was plain. He'd rather face their suspicion than return to the emptiness he'd known before. That night, as the fire burned low and the women slept by the stove, Eli lay awake, staring at the dark rafters above. He thought of the man at the post, of the tracks in the dirt, of the risk to tightening around them like a noose. But his mind also wandered to the sight of Ayanna steadying the fence post, Nita grinding corn with patient hands, and Tallulah laughing softly as she worked. The tension between fear and peace tore through him, but when sleep finally took him, he knew one thing for certain. He had let them in, and there was no turning back. The days that followed found a rhythm Eli hadn't known in years. The women rose early, working as though they'd been born to that land. Ayanna carried water and split kindling without hesitation. Nita patched what few blankets he owned. Tallulah followed him to the corral each morning, learning the slow, patient rhythm of cattle work. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. For the first time since Clara's death, the air carried the sounds of life, laughter, quiet talk, movement that belonged. Still, Eli couldn't shake what had happened at the post. The man's words about tracks weren't idle talk. Out here, every rumor grew like wildfire until it burned its way into truth. And Eli knew it was only a matter of time before someone came looking for proof. And proof slept by his stove every night. Eli McCord felt that weight pressing on him every morning as he pulled on his boots, the quiet dread that something was bound to give. The break came sooner than he expected. Late one afternoon, with the sun sinking low and the air cooling sharp, he spotted a thin trail of dust rising out on the road. 2 riders were coming in slow. Not rushing. Not friendly either. Eli stepped off the porch, shotgun in hand, holding it loose, but ready. By the barn, Ayanna, Nita, and Tallulah froze where they were gathering wood, their dark eyes fixed on the trail. The riders pulled up at the gate, reins creaking, dust curling around their boots. They were men he recognized from Gus Harlan's post, loud-mouthed drifters who'd never fought a day in their lives but carried themselves like war heroes. One spat into the dirt before calling out, "Evenin', McCord. Heard talk there's tracks out this way, not yours. Figured we'd take a look." Eli's jaw tightened. Fence went down. "Stray's been wandering." "Tracks all over," he said flatly. The second rider leaned in his saddle eyes, squinting past Eli toward the cabin. "Funny thing," he drawled. "You been buying more beans and coffee than one man needs? You feeding ghosts out here?" Eli's gut burned hot, but his stare never wavered. This was the moment he'd been dreading. If he slipped, if they caught even a hint of truth, the women were finished. "I work long," he said evenly. "A man eats more when he works." The first rider smirked. "Or maybe you got company." His gaze shifted toward the barn just in time to catch a flicker of movement. Tallulah crouched in the shadows, ducked back too late. The grin on his face widened. "Thought so. Word is you got a soft spot for Apache women." That true Eli took one step forward, the shotgun rising just enough to send a message. His voice came low and cold as a loaded chamber. "I said the fence went down. You boys got no business here." For a long moment, the world held still, the only sound the faint rattle of a horse's bridle. Inside, the women barely breathed. Finally, the men chuckled a mean, knowing sound. "All right, McCord," one said. "Keep your secrets. But secrets don't stay buried long out here. They turned their horses and rode off, slow laughter trailing behind them like dust. Eli let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He lowered the shotgun, his hands clenched hard around the stock. When he turned, Tallulah stood near the barn door, eyes wide, face pale in the fading light. She didn't speak, didn't need to. She understood. They were in danger now. That evening, tension sat heavy in the cabin. Ayanna stayed close to the stove, her expression calm, but unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "Men come again. Soon." Eli nodded. "I know." He looked at each of them in turn. "If they find you here, they'll take you. Doesn't matter what I say." Nita set her sewing down, her fingers trembling. "You send us away?" she asked, her English broken, but the fear behind it clear as glass. Eli stared into the fire for a long time. He thought of the years of silence, the empty nights, the way the cabin used to sound when Clara was gone, hollow, endless, dead. Then he thought of laughter echoing off these same walls just days ago, of warmth of life returning in small, fragile ways. He knew his answer before he spoke it. "No," he said finally, voice firm. "You're staying." Ayanna met his eyes, giving a small nod, as if she'd expected nothing less. Tallulah's lips curved into a faint smile, a flicker of relief softening her face. Nita bowed her head and whispered something in Apache, a prayer, or maybe a promise. Eli leaned back, the firelight dancing across his weathered face. The weight of his choice pressed hard against his chest. He knew it would change everything. The town wouldn't forgive him. Trouble would come. But as he watched the women settle near the fire, their presence filling that lonely cabin with life again, he understood one thing for sure: he'd already crossed the line. He had chosen them. And when the next knock came on his door, he'd stand between them and whatever hell waited outside. The rider's visit left a shadow that hung over the ranch. For 2 days, Eli worked harder than he had in years, mending fences, hauling feed eyes, flicking to the horizon every few minutes. The women felt it too. Their laughter faded. Their movements turned cautious, their glances toward him questioning, as if silently asking what would happen when those men came back, because they all knew they would. Eli carried that fear like a stone in his chest. Eli McCord had made his choice, told them they were staying, but saying it aloud was one thing, living with what came after was another. Each night as he lay in the dark, listening to their soft breathing by the stove, the pop and crackle of firewood, his mind circled the same truths. He hadn't told them just how much the town despised Apache, how gossip could turn into a noose faster than the wind could carry a rumor. He had no family left, no friends willing to stand by him if things turned bad. The truth was simple. By taking those women in, he'd hitched his fate to theirs. The next morning, as the smell of beans and dry bread filled the cabin, he forced himself to speak the words he'd been holding back. He looked across the table at them, voice low but steady. "If men come again, it won't be the same. It'll be worse. You need to understand what it means to stay here." Ayanna met his eyes and nodded slowly, her face calm, her voice grounded. "We know." There was something in her tone, something that unsettled him. Like danger wasn't a threat to her, but an old companion she'd learned to live beside. Still, Eli pressed on. "They'll call you thieves, whores, worse. And they'll call me worse for sheltering you. They won't stop till one of us bleeds." You understand that Nita lowered her gaze, her lips trembling before she nodded faintly. Tallulah tilted her head, eyes sharp, defiant, daring him to say more. She murmured something in Apache voice, rich with fire and pride. Ayanna translated softly. "She says she's not afraid, We already lost everything. Nothing left to fear. The words sank deep into Eli's chest, heavier than he cared to admit. He studied their faces, scarred by loss, marked by endurance. They carried more strength than any man in town would ever see. And he felt it then, a strange mixture of weight and pride. Like he was no longer just one broken man, but part of something bigger, something alive. That day they worked as one. Eli cut new fence posts, while Ayanna held them steady for hammering. Nita mended one of his torn shirts using thread pulled from the hem of her own dress. Tallulah followed him into the pasture, helping drive a thin steer back into the pen. When the animal kicked against the gate, she burst into laughter, bright, full, unguarded. For a fleeting moment, the ranch didn't feel like it was dying anymore. It felt like it was waking up. By evening, when the sky turned deep purple and the firelight flickered gold against the log walls, something had changed. The fear still lived there, quiet and waiting, but so did something warmer, something that felt almost like peace. Eli set another log on the fire and turned. Ayanna was watching him. She didn't look away. For a long moment their eyes met, and something passed between them, unspoken, but clear. Trust. Later, as the women laid their blankets by the stove, Tallulah brushed past him, her hand grazing his arm. The touch was light, almost accidental, but the warmth of it stayed. His pulse jumped. And for the first time in years, he didn't shove the feeling down. He let it sit glowing quietly under his ribs. Nita approached soon after, the mended shirt folded neatly in her hands. She held it out to him without speaking. The stitches were uneven, but careful. Her eyes flickered up once, full of quiet hope, pleading not to be cast aside. Then she lowered her gaze and stepped back. Eli sat at the table long after they'd drifted to sleep. The firelight trembled over his face as he stared into the flame, thinking of the riders of the town, of the danger crawling closer by the day. He knew the law wouldn't save them. He knew men like Hank Dobbs and Silas Boone would come again, maybe with more behind them. But he also knew there was no sending the women away now. They'd stitched themselves into his life, one look, one word, one quiet act at a time. When he finally lay down, he heard Tallulah laughing softly in her sleep, Nita breathing even and calm, Ayanna shifting once before settling into silence. Eli closed his eyes. A single thought cut through him, sharp and certain. He wasn't living for himself anymore. And when the next storm came, he wouldn't face it alone. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that almost felt like peace. Eli rose before dawn, stepping out into the cold gray air, his breath curling like smoke as he checked the stock. Ayanna was always the first to join him, hauling water-stacking kindling, moving with the steady authority of someone who'd been responsible all her life. Nita tended the cabin, sewing, sweeping, keeping the fire strong, and Tallulah, bold as a colt, followed him, wherever he went, learning how to handle the cattle, how to mend fences, how to read the sky for weather. For the first time since Clara's death, Eli's world felt full again. The burden of others depending on him brought both tension and purpose, and deep inside that long-dead part of him began to stir awake. The memory of those two riders hung over Eli McCord like a storm cloud that wouldn't move on. Every time he glanced toward the trail, he half expected to see dust rising again, hooves pounding, questions waiting. He told himself he was ready for whatever came, but deep down he knew he wasn't. 3 evenings later, the sound came again, horses. More than 2 this time. He heard them before he saw them, the dull thunder of hooves rolling across hard earth, voices carried low on the wind. His stomach tightened like a fist. Eli stepped out onto the porch, shotgun in hand, eyes narrowed against the fading sun. 4 riders approached, their shapes cut in shadow against the red horizon. Inside, the women froze. Nita dropped the spoon she'd been holding. It clattered against the table. Tallulah stiffened near the door, her dark eyes flashing between fear and defiance. Ayanna placed a calm, steadying hand on her sister's arm and murmured something in Apache, quiet, commanding. Then she looked toward Eli through the open doorway, her gaze sharp, questioning. What now? Eli stepped off the porch and planted his boots in the dirt. The riders slowed as they reached the gate, their horses snorting dust swirling around their legs. He recognized 2 of them, Hank Dobbs and Silas Boone, the same troublemakers from Gus Harlan's post. The other 2 were strangers, but their faces carried that same crooked confidence, the kind that came from men who thought no law could touch them. One of them grinned, his teeth yellow in the setting light. "Well now, look who's home. Word in town says you've been keeping company out here, McCord." That true Eli's grip on the shotgun tightened. "Only company I got is cattle," he said flatly. The men chuckled. "Funny," Hank said. "A couple fellas swear they saw shadows moving in your cabin the other night. Unless your cows learned to stand upright, you got something hiding out here." Eli's jaw locked. He could feel the women's eyes on him from inside, waiting to see what he'd do. His silence stretched too long, and the riders mistook it for fear. Silas leaned forward in his saddle, his grin turning mean. "You hiding something, McCord? Maybe a few squaws you don't want the law hearing about." The word hit like a hot knife. Eli felt the anger rise fast, burning through his chest. He stepped closer to the gate, the shotgun lifting a few inches. "You boys got no right here," he said, voice low and hard as iron. "This is my land. You turn around and ride back the way you came, or you'll leave heavier than you arrived." The laughter stopped. Dust drifted silent between them. The horses shifted nervously, sensing the tension. For a heartbeat, it felt like one wrong breath would set off the gunfire. Then one of the strangers spit into the dirt and pulled on his reins. "Ain't worth it tonight," he said. "But we'll be back, and when we do, we'll see what kind of family you're keeping." They wheeled their horses and rode off the fading sun, catching their dust as it curled into the twilight. Eli didn't move until they were gone. When he finally lowered the shotgun, his hands were trembling around the stock. He turned toward the cabin. In the doorway, the 3 women stood framed by the firelight faces, pale eyes wide. Relief flickered across them, but it carried no comfort. The danger hadn't passed. It had just been postponed. That night's supper was quiet and heavy. Tallulah ate quick, her gaze darting toward the window every few seconds. Nita barely touched her food, her hands shaking in her lap. Ayanna stayed calm, but her jaw was tight, her shoulders squared as if bracing for what she already knew. Finally she spoke. "They come again. More men next time." Eli nodded, throat dry. "I know." Nita's eyes filled with tears. Her voice trembled, her English broken but clear enough. "If they take us, what then? Kill us?" Eli set his bowl aside, leaning forward. "They won't take you," he said. The words came out sharper than he meant, but he didn't take them back. He'd already made his choice in the silence of his sleepless nights. He knew what it meant to stand against a town, to defy men who believed cruelty was their right. But he also knew what he couldn't do. He couldn't send these women out to die in the dust. He couldn't stand by while someone dragged them away. Ayanna studied him for a long moment, her eyes unreadable. Then slowly, she nodded. "Then we stand," she said. "Together." The words hit deep, heavy as an oath. Eli felt the weight of them settle on his chest, stronger than any vow he'd made since his wedding day. For the first time since Clara's death, he wasn't standing alone. The days that followed carried that tension thick, unspoken. Eli worked harder than ever, scanning the horizon between each hammer stroke, each fence post. The women moved with quiet purpose, their laughter gone now, their steps cautious, their eyes sharp. They didn't have to speak it aloud. They all knew the men would be back, and next time they wouldn't be looking for talk. Preparations began in quiet, determined rhythm. Eli McCord showed Tallulah how to load the old revolver he kept locked in a chest, her small hands clumsy at first, but quick to learn, eyes alight with fierce resolve. He taught Ayanna how to hammer nails into the barn door so it could be barred from the inside, the thud of metal on wood echoing across the yard like a promise. Meanwhile, Nita gathered stones from the creek, lining them neatly along the porch, as if building a wall, small, useless maybe, but symbolic all the same. Each task seemed almost foolish against the power of armed men, yet every stroke, every motion meant something. They weren't waiting to be saved anymore. They were preparing to fight for what was theirs together. That night, as the fire burned low and shadows crept across the log walls, Eli sat at the table, eyes fixed on the women sleeping near the stove. He thought of all the questions that had haunted him, why he'd kept them, why he hadn't turned them in, why he was willing to risk everything for them. The answer burned clear as the dying firelight, because they had nowhere else, and because, without him realizing it, they had become his. The cabin that had once felt hollow now carried their voices, their laughter, the soft cadence of Apache, whispered in the dark. It carried life again. And Eli knew when those riders returned, as they surely would, he would not let the town rip that life away. That night, he lay down with the shotgun within reach. Fear still lived in his chest, but beneath it burned something stronger resolve. He was no longer just surviving. He was a man with something to protect. And when the knock came, he'd be ready. For days, no knock came. The ranch stayed still, the silence stretching tight as wire. The only sounds were the scrape of tools, the whisper of wind through cottonwoods, and the women's soft voices when they thought he wasn't listening. Every crow that lifted from the fence post, every dust swirl on the trail, made Eli's pulse tighten. He knew those men hadn't forgotten. Men like that never did. Inside, the women adapted to life under threat. Ayanna became sharper, her eyes always scanning the horizon while her sisters worked. Nita spoke more often now, her English halting but improving, asking names of tools, of animals, of things she meant to master. It was her quiet way of staking claim to this new world. Tallulah, restless as wind, insisted on helping with the cattle. Every morning she followed Eli to the corral, her hair tied back, her expression determined no matter how bone-tired she was. Still, tension hung thick. At supper, the women's eyes often flicked toward the door, half expecting the sound of boots on wood. Eli himself kept the shotgun propped beside his chair, now never back in the chest. An outsider might have asked why he didn't just ride into town and tell the sheriff why he didn't try to stop trouble before it started. The answer sat plain in his thoughts. The law wasn't built for folks like them. The sheriff wasn't an ally. The moment Eli stepped into town asking for help, the women would be dragged off and never seen again. He knew it as sure as the sunrise. The storm finally came late on the fourth evening. It began with the sound of horses, closer, heavier, more of them. Eli stepped outside, his gut hardening. 6 riders moved down the trail, their silhouettes dark against the fading light dust rising behind them like smoke. "Stay inside," he called over his shoulder. "Bar the door." His tone left no room for argument, though he knew they wouldn't sit idle. The riders drew up at the fence. One man, scarred across the cheek, leaned forward on his saddle. "Evening, McCord," he said. "We gave you time to think. Now we want the truth. You keeping them Apache girls in there?" Eli's shotgun rested easy in his arms, steady but not raised. "Ain't your business," he said evenly. The man sneered. "It is when you're breaking the law. You know what happens to a man caught hiding runaways. You'll lose this land, maybe more." Another rider spat in the dust. "Hell, we don't even need the sheriff. We can handle this ourselves." The air thickened. The horses stamped, snorting in the silence. Inside the cabin, Ayanna whispered sharply in Apache, guiding her sisters. Nita slid the revolver into her trembling hand, steadying her breath. Tallulah pressed her ear to the door, jaw clenched, ready to move if it came to that. Eli drew a slow breath, every decision heavy as stone. He thought of Clara's grave, of the years he'd spent living like a ghost in his own life. Now that ghost had something to fight for. He squared his shoulders, eyes locked on the men at the gate. Whatever came next, he'd already made peace with it. The emptiness that had once threatened to swallow Eli McCord whole was gone now. He thought of the women sitting by his fire at night, their quiet laughter mingling with the crackle of burning wood. He thought of their hands working beside his in the daylight, their presence filling his lonely cabin with the pulse of life again. Fear of the town still lingered deep inside him, the old familiar dread of being outnumbered, but it was buried now beneath something heavier, something stronger. Eli stepped closer to the fence, raising the shotgun just enough to show he meant every word. "They stay here," he said. "That's the end of it." For a heartbeat, the land went still. Then one of the riders snarled and drew his pistol. The sound cracked the air, and Eli fired first. The shotgun roared through the fading light, echoing off the hills. Horses reared and men shouted, the sudden chaos breaking the calm wide open. One rider tumbled from his saddle, clutching his bleeding arm, while the others scrambled for cover, returning wild shots that splintered the cabin walls. Inside, Nita's hands trembled as she grabbed the revolver and pushed it toward Ayanna. Without hesitation, Ayanna took it, crawled to the window, and fired. Her aim was true enough to send a rider ducking for his life. Tallulah shouted something in Apache, a sound caught between fear and fury, as she gripped the doorframe, ready to burst through if needed. Eli reloaded fast, jaw set tight. He moved with the precision of a man who had seen blood before and knew what it cost. Another blast rang out, and the riders broke, retreating into the dusk with curses trailing behind them, until all that was left was the whisper of wind through grass and the ringing in Eli's ears. He lowered the shotgun slowly, chest heaving. The door creaked open behind him, and the women rushed out, faces pale, eyes wide. Tallulah reached him first, her hands flying over his arms and chest, checking for wounds. Nita followed, tears streaking down her cheeks, though she said nothing. Ayanna stood, last revolver still clutched in her hand, her face steady, but her breathing hard. "They'll come again," she said quietly. Eli nodded. Maybe he rasped. "But they know now I won't give you up." Tallulah pressed herself against his side, trembling, her forehead brushing his shoulder. He let her stay there, resting one calloused hand on her back, not as a lover yet, but as a man who had chosen to protect what was his. Nita stepped closer, gripping his sleeve, silent but resolute. Ayanna finally lowered the revolver, her gaze locking with his, strong, certain, unbroken. Inside, the cabin smelled of gunpowder and smoke. Bullet holes marred the walls, but the fire still burned steady in the stove. Eli looked at the three women who had once arrived, broken, starving, and frightened, and realized they were no longer just surviving under his roof. They were standing with him. Someone else might have asked why he risked everything for them when he could have turned them out and saved himself. But the answer was already carved deep into him. The moment he'd opened his door, they'd stopped being strangers. They were his family now. That night, as the women slept near the stove, their bodies finally at rest, Eli sat in his chair with the shotgun across his lap. The firelight flickered across his face, the weight in his chest no longer fear alone, but something truer purpose. He had stood his ground, and they had stood with him. For the first time in years, he felt it the solid truth that he had something worth fighting for. And if the riders came again, they wouldn't find a lonely man. They'd find a family ready to defend their own. By morning, the cabin smelled of smoke and ash. Bullet holes pocked the outer walls, and the fence lay broken where the horses had scattered. Eli moved through the yard, shotgun in hand, every muscle sore from the night before. He knew the men wouldn't leave it at that. They'd be back, and next time they'd bring more. Inside, Ayanna cleaned the revolver with careful precision. Nita boiled water, cutting cloth into strips for bandages, though none of them were hurt. It was something to do. Something that steadied the hands and quieted the fear. Tallulah stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her body wound tight like a wild colt about to run. None of them spoke, but their silence said everything. They all knew what was coming. That morning, Eli faced the question he had been dodging since the day he found them by the river. What future could they possibly have here? He could fight off riders, but sooner or later, the whole town would come. Gossip turned to hatred fast in the West, and mobs didn't need truth to light a fire. Their safety depended on more than the barrel of his gun. It depended on whether he was willing to claim them openly. Not as fugitives, not as strangers, but as his family. And as the hours passed, he knew the answer clear as daylight. Eli McCord thought of the long, hollow years that had followed Clara's death, the silence that had eaten away at his cabin like rot in the wood. Then he thought of them. Ayanna's calm, steady gaze, Nita's quiet resilience, Tallulah's wild laughter, even in the shadow of fear. Those three women had filled the emptiness with something he hadn't felt in years' life. They had given him purpose again. Sending them away would not protect them. It would destroy them. By late afternoon, he saw dust on the horizon. This time it wasn't just a few riders. Eli counted nearly a dozen men, their silhouettes breaking the glare of the dying sun. Some faces he knew from Gus Harlan's post. Others were strangers, the kind of men drawn to cruelty like flies to blood. They carried rifles and rope. They weren't coming to threaten anymore. They were coming to take. Eli stepped out onto the porch, shotgun loaded, jaw tight. Behind him, Ayanna stood tall with the revolver in hand. Nita clutched her bandages, ready to heal wounds if there would be any left to tend. Tallulah stood nearest the door, chin high, eyes fierce. The leader rode forward, Jed Crow, the scar-faced man from before. "Enough games, McCord," he called. "You hand them over now. We'll take them back to town, and maybe we'll let you keep your land." Eli's voice cut through the air like a whip. "They're not yours to take." Jed sneered. "You think their wives ain't no law says you can do that?" Eli's fingers tightened on the shotgun. He'd expected the mockery, the filth that men like Crow used to strip dignity from others. But he stood his ground. "Law don't mean a damn thing if it ain't backed by a man's will. I'll say it once cross this fence and I'll drop the first one of you." The air tensed. The men shifted in their saddles, glancing at each other. Some looked eager for blood. Others hesitated when they saw the women behind him, unbroken, unashamed, ready. Ayanna raised the revolver, her hand steady as stone. Tallulah shouted something fierce in Apache, her voice cutting through the still air like the cry of a hawk. Jed spat into the dirt. "Ain't worth the blood," he growled. "But mark my words, McCord Town won't ever take you back." Eli met his glare without flinching. "I don't need the town," he said quietly. "I got what I need here." One by one, the riders turned their horses. They rode off slow, the sound of hooves fading into the horizon, their threats drifting behind like dust. No one fired a shot. They had tested him and found his resolve unbreakable. When the last echo of hoofbeats disappeared, Eli lowered the shotgun. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what he'd just chosen. The women hadn't moved. Ayanna's gaze held his, calm and proud. Nita pressed a trembling hand to her chest relief, softening her face. Tallulah stepped forward, touching his arm, her eyes bright with something deeper than gratitude. Inside, the air changed. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was alive. Eli spoke, then his voice rough but certain. "You stay here," he said. "This is your home now. Not for a night, not for a season. For good. You're mine to protect, and I'm yours to keep." Ayanna nodded once, slow and sure, setting the revolver on the table. Nita's lips curved into a small, trembling smile, the first he'd ever seen from her. Tallulah laughed softly through tears, leaning her head against his shoulder, her laughter breaking into something like relief. That night, the cabin felt warmer than it ever had. Firelight glowed against the patched walls. The smell of beans and corn filled the room. Eli sat among them, no longer haunted by the ghost of Clara's absence, but carrying that love forward like a scar that had finally healed. He hadn't replaced her. He'd built something new. Whatever questions remained about the town, the land, or what future might come, faded beneath one simple truth. They were no longer bound by chance, but by choice. As the women drifted to sleep near the stove, Eli stayed awake, listening to their breathing steady safe. The cabin still bore scars, bullet holes, and cracks in the walls, but for the first time in years, it wasn't empty. When he finally lay down, Tallulah's hand brushed his. Ayanna murmured softly in her sleep, and Nita's breathing evened out beside the fire. Eli closed his eyes, the truth settling deep in his chest. The fight was over, not because the town had surrendered, but because he had made his choice, and so had they. In that choice, they had built something the world couldn't take, a home born of courage loss and the will to stand together. A family not by law or blood, but by heart.